The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. On this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from The World of Nasrudin by Idries Shah. Camels and Men. Nasrudin, asked his neighbour, which is more intelligent, a camel or a man? A camel, replied the mullah, because it carries heavy loads without complaint, but never asks for an additional load. Man, on the other hand, burdened by responsibility, is always choosing to add to his loads. Careless Head. Nasrudin was tying his turban when the wind caught the cloth and carried it away. What a shame, lamented his friend. That was a beautiful piece of Indian muslin. I should never have trusted my careless head with it. That is the third turban it has lost this week, said Nasrudin. Carving Pheasant. At the king's table one evening, Nasrudin was asked to carve the pheasant. Obligingly, he rose and began to serve the other diners. The head he offered to the king, saying, "You are our leader and the head of your family." The wings he gave to the court treasurer. "Your embezzlement will be discovered, and you will soon take flight." The feet he gave to the commander of the army with the words, "You will soon march into battle." The neck he gave to the grand vizier, saying, "Your own neck will one day be broken by the hangman's noose." The rest of the bird he put on his own plate, saying, "What remains is mine, because I have carved so well." Chains tomorrow. Nasrudin was walking home with one of his pupils when he saw some thieves breaking into a house. The mullah walked quickly by. "Who were those men," asked the schoolboy, "that you hurried by so fast?" "Convicts," replied Nasrudin. "But they had no chains." "They will get those tomorrow." Cheating the Stars. Nasrudin had made quite a name for himself as the town fortune-teller, for his predictions generally came true. One day an old woman approached him and asked, "Where is my eldest son, Baydar, and what is his fortune?" "He is living in Baghdad," replied the mullah, "and will remain there in good health for many years to come." At that moment a caravan of traders arrived in town. "Does the mother of Baydar live here?" asked one of the camel-men. "I have been asked by her daughter-in-law to report that Baydar is dead and she is now living in India." The angry crowd turned on Nasrudin. "You are a fraud," they clamoured, "and your predictions are worthless." "My friends," announced Nasrudin, "I am not a fraud, but a fool. The constellations indicate that Baydar enjoys good health, but I was a fool to read the fortune of a man who cheats the stars." Child Psychology. Nasrudin's wife was in labour, but the midwife was unable to deliver the child. Finally, in desperation, she turned to the mullah. "You are meant to be a wise man. Is there anything you can do to help?" "If only you had asked before," exclaimed Nasrudin, and he rushed off to the bazaar. He returned a few minutes later carrying a top, which he started spinning on the floor. "Have you gone completely mad?" squawked the midwife. "Have patience," replied Nasrudin calmly. "When the child sees the toy, he will jump out and play with it." Choice Meals. Nasrudin was invited to dine at the house of the town miser. But when the time came for the family to eat, the mullah was dismayed to be served nothing more than a bowl of milk. "Eat, my friend," implored the miser. "Have some yogurt, some cream, and some cheese. Have some rice pudding, some custard, and some butter." When the mullah had drained the bowl, he made his excuses and returned home hungry. Next day he returned the miser's invitation. As soon as his guest arrived, he ushered him to the dining table, placed a cushion behind his back, a knife and fork in his hands, and a bowl in front of him. When the miser looked into the bowl, he saw only water. "Eat, my friend," cried Nasrudin. "Eat your fill of watermelon and soup. Eat the fish and the choicest vegetables, rice and sorbet." City Doctors. While in the city, Nasrudin collapsed in the street. Luckily, he was directly outside the house of a doctor. As the man examined him, the mullah gasped, "Notable physician, I have suffered from this illness for quite some time and do not expect a city man such as yourself to find the cure." "It is quite simple," said the doctor, examining the weak man. "You are fainting away due to starvation. Food is the only medicine you need." With this, he ordered rice and meat to be brought for the traveller. Sure enough, Nasrudin found his strength returning. "You are a genius. You have healed a dying man. My whole village is suffering from the same disease. As soon as I have the energy, I shall return home and tell my friends and neighbours to come to you for similar treatment." Civil Unrest. Tamerlane, the ruler of the universe, was displeased by unrest in a far corner of his empire. Word arrived that in one of the cities of this region, the peasants had revolted and murdered their oppressive landlord. Tamerlane called his greatest generals to quell the violence at once. "Take all the infantrymen you need. Take ladders with which to climb the city walls. Take cannons to reduce the place to dust. Take elephants and camels to strike fear into the heart of every man, woman, and child." "You have forgotten the one weapon which could settle the dispute before the most powerful element of your forces can," Nasrudin whispered in the royal ear. "What is that?" Tamerlane asked in anticipation. "One sensible man who can listen to the complaints of the locals and then take his place as landlord." Close to an idiot. One day, Nasrudin took a seat in the Turkish baths. The steam was so thick that he could not make out the man on his right. "How dare you," snarled the king through the steam, "sitting next to me in such a familiar way? You must be close to an idiot." "Hang on while I measure," replied Nasrudin, feeling the space between them. "I'd say about 1/2 foot." Coats. One winter's day, the judge met Nasrudin in the bazaar. "Extraordinary," he mused. "I am wearing the warmest of my fur-lined coats, and am still chilled by the wind, while you, dressed in rags, do not appear to feel the cold. How is that?" "A man who is wearing all his clothes cannot afford to feel the cold," replied Nasrudin. Colourblind. The Shah was very vain indeed. One day, the court barber remarked that the royal beard was starting to grey, and the unfortunate man was immediately beheaded. The ruler then looked around for another barber. "Tell me," he asked the first candidate, "do you see any grey hairs in my beard?" 1 or 2, sire," admitted the man.
"Call the executioner,"
ordered the Shah, and he too was led away. The monarch turned to the next applicant for the job and asked the same question. Horrified by the fate of the last, he bowed low and said, "Majesty, your noble beard is jet black."
"Liar!"
bellowed the Shah, and immediately had the man beheaded. Finally, he turned to Nasrudin.
"You, how would you describe the colours of my beard?"
"Alas," said the mullah, "I am colourblind." Come Judgement Day. The whole village had turned out to listen to the teachings of a renowned sage who was touring the country. At the end of the sermon, the simple villagers broke into noisy applause. Raising one ring-encrusted hand, the orator signalled for silence. "My good men and women, on the day of judgment go to the banks of the river so that the chaste and the righteous may drink the waters of eternal life and pass eternity in paradise." "Hang on a minute," sobbed Nasrudin, who had listened to the sermon with pious tears streaming down his face. "If only the chaste may taste the holy waters on Judgment Day, how will you or I be able to drink?" Commander of the Hoofed. Nasrudin was unpopular with the other courtiers, who thought him a favourite of the king. "Mullah, the king has made you commander of his donkeys," joked the Grand Vizier one day. "How honoured I am," replied Nasrudin. "Chief of the donkeys must be the best position in the land." "How so?" asked the Vizier. "Because it would put me in charge of you." Compensation. One day, Nasrudin was called as a witness in a criminal case. While he was at the courtroom, thieves broke into the mullah's house and stole all his furniture. Returning home to find his possessions gone, Nasrudin headed straight back to the courtroom. He piled chairs, tables, and benches into a cart and prepared to ride off.
"Do you want to be thrown in jail for the rest of your worthless life?" stormed the irate judge.
"Certainly not, Your Honour," replied the mullah. "I am simply reclaiming what is rightfully mine." Confused sentences. All in the courtroom fell silent when they heard the judge sentence a minor offender to 50 lashes. The silence was broken by Nasrudin, who began to howl with laughter.
"Be quiet, or I shall hold you in contempt of court,"
shouted the apoplectic magistrate. "Forgive me, Your Honour, but you and I both know that the maximum lashes this man can bear is 5. I naturally assumed that you had confused your mathematics and multiplied the just sentence by 10. Console yourself. The king aimed his arrow at a stag, fired, and missed. "An unlucky shot, Majesty," groaned the Grand Vizier. "A faulty bow, Majesty," the treasurer simpered. "Console yourself with the knowledge of how many innocent men you have succeeded in killing, Majesty," suggested Nasrudin. Crime and Punishment. While on his travels, Nasrudin entered a particularly devout land. Very soon he was accused of being an infidel. His hands and feet were bound, and he was bundled off to stand trial. The king, a religious fanatic, sentenced the non-believer to 50 lashes.
"What have you to say in your defence before the punishment is carried out?"
I am no heretic, sire, cried Nasrudin. You have commanded that I be beaten. But when the Prophet wanted to convert the Arabs to Islam, he directed that they be hit with sticks. How is it that I must receive similar punishment for supposedly renouncing Islam? Crowded house. Nasrudin and his wife were talking about their parents. My mother can cook ever so well, said the mullah. How can you say that? Shrieked his wife. My mother is 100 times the better cook. Seeing red, Nasrudin grabbed the woman by the scruff of her neck and threw her out into the garden. What are you doing? Asked his neighbour. There is little enough room in the house for two, explained Nasrudin. 4 is just too many. 4? Yes, first there was just me and her, then my mother crept in, and finally her mother also came to stay. The house was so crammed with them and their pots and pans that my wife fell out of the door. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation and is copyright 2019. All rights reserved.